Let's get into today's topic. As Chung introduced, we're getting into a relationship series. And this first one is work-love balance, referring specifically to romantic love. And then month after, we're going to look at vertical relationship, as in your boss, employer-employee relationships, your supervisor, those under them relationship. And then after that, we'll look at horizontal. But we are going to look at romantic love, which is a popular topic. And we were inspired to talk about this because as of the last about 2-3 meetings, we have noticed that there are lots of young people getting together. So I don't know if it's the weather, people need to cozy up more because it's colder. It's usually spring when these things happen, but maybe not in Australia. Maybe it's the winter time, but something is in the air. So we were motivated to really touch upon this topic. But obviously, I don't have enough time to get into anything really deeply. So we're going to touch upon some of the principles that may help you, that may point you to good help that's accessible, that's available out there. But I do want to make a disclaimer. The views that are going to be expressed is indeed Christian, is from the Bible. And if you disagree, you are completely entitled to have your opinion. And if you'd like to speak to us afterwards, we're happy to talk to you. We just ask that you respect this platform and that we are civil with one another and have good dialogue with each other. That is all. I want to start us off with an interesting passage that I think has a lot to glean from in terms of principles regarding love, relationship, and even pertaining to marriage in the scriptures. I want to point us to 1 Corinthians chapter 7. We'll look at verses 1 through 9. Now, this is not going to read like a Hallmark greetings card or what popular brand of greeting cards we have here. It's not going to read like a warm fuzzy, just a bit of warning. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, 1 through 9. The Bible says this, "Now concerning the matters about which you wrote, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman, but because of the temptation to sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife and each woman her own husband. The husband should give to his wife his conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband. For the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Do not deprive one another except perhaps by agreement for a limited time, that you may devote yourselves to prayer. But then come together again so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. Now as a concession, not a command, I say this, I wish that all were as myself am, but each has his own gift from God, one of one kind and one of another. To the unmarried and the widows, I say that it is good for them to remain single as I am, but if they cannot exercise self-control, they should marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion." Okay, I will come back to explaining some of what this passage says, but if you are familiar with the dialogues of our time, there's probably a couple of things that stood out right away as something not consonant with popular worldview today. So we may be able to get around to talk about some of these things. But the reason we wanted to talk about this is because of where a lot of you are as young people, young professionals, because we go through some interesting times as we grow through the seasons, especially as Asians, at which many of you are. And this is not a blanketed thing, but I'm just talking about the stuff that a lot of us experience. When we're in uni, our parents actually prevent us from having romantic relationships. Don't have a boyfriend, don't have a girlfriend, focus on studying, graduating, getting a job. And as soon as you do, and before you know it, your parents are already pressuring, why don't you have a boyfriend? Why don't you have a girl? When are you getting married? I mean, it goes from don't to like, why not yesterday, like right away? And so I can understand a bit of the pressure that you might feel. And also, perhaps it's the stage as well. You're getting to that place in mid-20s, and you're out of uni, And workplace also is not like the union life where it's much broader in its social circumference, if you will. You're limited to your workplace, and to even think about relationship and dating, unless there's a pool of people at church or through different, I don't know, party circles you might hang around in, especially to associate work and romance, it feels like it's getting more difficult. And especially if we put romance in the context of work, there's all kinds of tricky stuff if we go specifically into workplace romance. I don't know if you've ever been through HR orientation where they tell you about how workplace dating things work, but in workplaces, it's a sensitive issue, isn't it? I was looking up a few articles, and it's pretty clear that, at least in our workplaces, romantic relationship is very much discouraged. It can risk your employment, especially if it's between different rungs on the ladder, like supervisor to employee. So these are some bullet points as to why it's not okay to start dating your coworkers. I'm not saying you shouldn't at all, but this is something that's on the radar of your workplaces. A few bullet points. If somebody in certain position dates another person in another place, there is a perceived favoritism by other employees. There is diminished credibility of the supervisor in the eyes of his or her team. There is lowered employee morale. There is potential conflicts of interest. Violations of company policy. Some places, especially in financial industries, in banks, couples are not actually allowed to work in the same company, certainly not in the same department, things like that. Challenges to consistent enforcement of company policy, sexual harassment or discrimination claims by other employees, sexual harassment or discrimination claims by one of the partners if the relationship ends badly, internal gossips and rumors that can impact the overall work environment and the long-term careers of the individuals who are involved in the romance, privacy issues associated with employer inquiries into the romance. So it's tricky, right? So where do you go to find somebody if your workplace is not where you're going to find somebody? Well, I'm not saying that City Sanctum is the solution. That is not what I'm saying. But I'm okay with City Sanctum being part of the solution. What I mean by this is this. This is not a meat market, okay? This is not some cool happening club where you can go pick up on people. But this is where young people can come and be who they are. And if God's willing, you find somebody, we're happy with that. But what we want to do is we want to provide a platform where we can just grow as people in a healthy way. And if it means, if a part of your life involves romantic relationships and starting new relationships, we want to help you to look through those criteria through the scriptures and help you to consider what the Bible has to say about those things that can guide you as well. So going back to the passage that we just read in 1 Corinthians 7, I want to touch upon a few things from here in principle before moving on to what we might want to give you as recommendation. Now, this is not going to be a comprehensive expository treatment of 1 Corinthians 7. There's a lot more than just verses 1 through 9 to consider for that as well. First of all, in just quick reading of this passage, you might wonder, is God or is Apostle Paul or the Bible perhaps anti-marriage or viewing marriage as purely utilitarian thing? Because in verse 1 it says, concerning the matters about which you wrote, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with women. And then Paul says, I wish you were as I am, and by that he means single in verse 8. And he encourages people to actually not marry. You know, he really affirms singleness, it seems like. So at a quick reading, you might wonder, so is the Bible against relationships or marriage? I want to very clearly say no, because there are amazing passages throughout the scriptures that shows that God is, first of all, the creator and author of relationships and love. Genesis 2, where God creates people to have relationship, marriage between Adam and Eve. Song of Songs is a beautiful writing that is very explicit about what a romantic relationship is like. There's that great love passage in 1 Corinthians 13, and of course, a husband and wife representing church and Christ in Ephesians 5. But what this passage in 1 Corinthians 7 is saying is that marriage does add additional responsibility. That's really the point of this passage. Because if we read further down in that same chapter in verse 28, Paul says, those who marry will have worldly troubles, as I would spare you of that. Paul's really happy with the fact that as a single guy, he can do a whole lot of ministry. And you know, Paul, during his time, he was a missionary to the entire known world. He didn't single-handedly do it, but he was very much involved in the whole of the ministry spreading through the known world at the time. He did a tremendous amount of work. And then in verse 32 through 35, he expands on that. He says, I want you to be free from anxieties, because every married person will tell you there is some anxiety in marriage, okay? To be realistic. The unmarried man is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to please the Lord. That is, if that's how you are geared. But the married man is anxious about worldly things, how to please his wife, and his interests are divided. And the unmarried or betrothed woman is anxious about the things of the Lord, but how to be holy in body and spirit. But the married woman is anxious about worldly things, how to please her husband. I say this for your own benefit, not to lay any restraint upon you, but to promote good order and to secure your undivided devotion to the Lord. So he's saying that in serving the Lord, there is an added, a distinct advantage in being single. So if some of you were wondering if you would be more complete before God if you were married, Paul would disagree with you. Okay? But the main point he's really hitting at is that of contentment. He wants you to be content. In verses 17 and 20, he says, let each person lead the life that the Lord has assigned to him and to which God has called him. And this is my rule in all the churches. Verse 20, he says, each one should remain in the condition in which he has called. By this, he's saying, just because you're a God follower, just because you're a Christian, it doesn't mean you have to be married or unmarried, young or old, whether you're Jewish or Grecian, Gentile, it does not matter. He wants you to understand that once you come into relationship with God, the highest priority is relationship with God. And everything else is really almost inconsequential. How you live unto God is important, but your status, your circumstance is not that important. So Paul's really ultimately interested in the priority of eternal things over against the transient things. And that's clear in verse 31. He says, the present form of this world is passing away. So the reason I bring up this passage is because depending on your situation, you're greatly concerned about either being married or being single. And from an eternal perspective, from eternal scheme of things, that is not the most important thing, but rather how you're relating with God. But if you're getting into a relationship, you should do it right. And that's also the point. And we have some recommendations for you. This is not comprehensive. This is more of a direction thing, and they're outlined in the handout that you have there. There's 7 recommendations I'd like to make as you're considering relationships. Number 1 is that you're okay. Okay? Whether you're single, married, in a dating relationship, not dating, you're fine. As long as your mind is set on an even higher thing, even more important thing, even more ultimate thing, the eternal stuff of God. Number two, if you are a Christian getting into a relationship, 2 Corinthians 6:14 talks about do not be unequally yoked. That's a picture of a couple of laboring animals bound together by a tie. That thing is called a yoke. Usually, dual animals are used for more power, for plowing purpose. Obviously, if you put one big strong animal next to a very weak one, you're not going to plow a straight line. It's going to go in circles. That's a word picture for how our life course is going to go when we are principled in eternal things and we value eternal things, and we are bound together with somebody who doesn't value those things. And that's a huge deal. My wife and I, we have a good marriage, but it's not the kind of a idyllic, perfect marriage where there's never a problem. In fact, I don't think that's really a perfect marriage at all. We argue and fight sometimes, but the thing that we love about our argument is that it's usually about silly stuff. I'm so glad that we're not fighting about big principled issues, big philosophical issues, where we're scratching our heads and wondering whether we should be with each other because of these big differences. You know what I mean? It's such a relief to be able to bicker about small things, about why did you leave the toilet seat up or down, stuff like that. That's almost like a love language, if I can borrow a page from that. But do not be unequally yoked. I know people get into relationships often out of desperation. And I have seen many Christians who go to churches who are not thinking about these things when they get into relationships. And they get into relationships with unbelievers, and it's not because unbelievers are unclean or anything like that, okay? It's because you two are coming from a completely different fundamental values. And while that might not be much of an issue when you're going to see a movie and walking the beach, but when you're shaping life, you start to realize that maybe you guys are building on two different foundations, and it becomes increasingly problematic issues down the road. More on that stuff through different sources. Number three, begin with the end in mind is Franklin Covey's number 2 on his 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And that's the same way with Christians as well. The reason we, men and women, get together, according to biblical design, as God intended, is for marriage purpose. So, when you're dating, when you're seeking to go out with somebody, you want to ask yourself, like, why are you going out? Why are you dating? Is it because you're just lonely and you need something to fill you? Or are you really serious about honoring God's design and wanting to have a marriage relationship? Now, not everybody that you start to go out with and try dating is going to turn out to be your future husband, your future wife. And you might find that you two are not compatible. But the intent should be there. A desire to want to be in a marriage relationship instead of just dating around. Okay? This is too short a time to go get really into that. Number 4, seek help. Get accountability. There is only one kind of relationship between man and woman according to the biblical design, and that's marriage. The thing that I like to tell dating people is that you guys are still not a couple per se. You're still single. You're single until you have this ring on your finger. I'm married. I'm a couple, And even though you guys are sitting together, if you're not married, you're not technically a couple just yet in God's eye, because you haven't been covenanted together as a unit, you see? But often when people start going out, they get really ahead of themselves and assume a lot of the marriage tie scenarios, and they exercise that scenario in that relationship, and often we go out of bounds. And yes, we get into relationships that doesn't honor God, that doesn't please God. There is a place where God is okay with a sexual union, and that's in the context of marriage. And outside of that, God is not pleased with that. That's not how He designed life and what it means to thrive under His guidance. So for this, if you're a Christian, equally yoked, and you're starting to go out, get some accountability in your life. Get some people who would actually speak into your life, who loves you and cares enough to actually speak hard things and ask specific questions. There's some people who ask me to keep them accountable, and occasionally I meet with them, whether it's once a month or every other week, and I ask that question, like, how are you doing in your relationship with that person? And I get into the nitty-gritty, the specifics, to keep them accountable. So, number 5, get relationship or premarital counseling early on, and consult your church leaders and elders and pastors. Sometimes people come up to me and they ask me when I can marry them and if I would marry them. And after they've already been going out for a very long time and for years have developed a lot of bad relationship habits, and a little bit of premarital counseling is not going to rescue every situation. Sometimes it's really nice to get an assessment early on and then discover what are some things that you guys can work on as couples, and to actually take the rest of the dating period to work on those things actively instead of just seeing movie after movie, a trip after trip, and just filling your relationship with entertainment and expecting the two complicated lives to somehow magically work out at the end of it. Deal with some really important issues early on and see where you guys are. Get some assessment and good counseling, and then use the remaining dating time as you're preparing for marriage to work on those things constructively. And then towards closer time to marriage, maybe take another assessment and see how far you've come. That's a great way. And it's always kind of a sad thing when we have to do an assessment and then the results come out in a very discouraging way, and we have to talk about tough stuff. And often enough, those assessments are quite revealing. But different church, different pastor leaders use different ways of doing premarital counseling. But I would really encourage you to go seek after your church leaders about these things. Number 6, keep a healthy balance between couple time and group, community, or church time, because often some couples get together and you don't see them ever because outside of work, they live in a cave by themselves. The cave is called the La La Land, and you just don't see them until you get invited to their wedding. But it's unhealthy when you live in isolation like that. You can do a lot of things wrong in isolation. Often, we live in isolation, especially when we don't want to be bothered and when we don't want accountability, when we have things to hide. So rather than live alone like that, share life with your family, your friends, your community, your church, and develop a healthy relational habit that way. Okay? Number 7, pray together, obviously. Now, this is not enough time to deal with almost anything. We don't have enough time for that. But there's some good resources out there, and they're listed there. It's a small font. Use your magnifying glasses, or you can take a picture and zoom in. And so these are some good resources. Don't go into relationship just haphazardly. I think there is a wise way to do it. And you start out by asking questions. You start by talking to people and see where you're blindsided and how people can shed more light on those things. Okay? But let's also not idolize being in a relationship. You guys are all unique and very special, and God is dealing with you each individually, and God's timing for you is all different. So let's not get swept away by the fact that a number of people are getting into relationship and thinking, well, I guess this is a season for me too. But grow in the Lord and consider the eternal things more seriously. And as you consider those things, God will make other things more clear. Okay?